Hi there, and thank you so much for stopping by today. My name is Mohammad Farooq Anwar, and the question that I wanted to go over with you guys today is what does open source really mean? Is it just another way of saying free software? Well, it is true that open source software is distributed at no cost, but it's really about freedom. By this, I mean the freedom for users and developers to do much more with open source software. It is code that is published publicly, and anyone can see, use, or modify the code for their needs. Okay, a quick bit of history. How did open source come about? Years ago, most large software projects happen inside private companies. They sell their proprietary software, typically with after sales support. Then, in the early 80s, interest in open source projects picked up, but it really took off about a decade later with Linux. That is when developers began combining the two approaches, mixing proprietary software with open source. Red Hat is one of the best examples with Red Hat Enterprise Linux or RHEL. But Red Hat has an open source counterpart called CentOS. It is the free version of Red Hat. So why did Red Hat donate the CentOS source code to an open source community? It is not about charity. Like a lot of for profit companies, they have worked out a win win situation. On one hand, the company gets help building and improving the base of their commercial product. On the other hand, open source devs get commercial grade code at no cost and the freedom to extend it. Okay, with that history behind us, let us cover the mechanics and answer a few who does what questions. As I mentioned earlier, open source allow you to improve and build upon a base. To get that done, you first need a few things. We begin with the repository. If you're going to share and collaborate, you need to make it easy to access. Repositories or repos, as most developers call them, are collaboration platforms like GitHub or GitLab where you can get source code, report bugs, or suggest improvements. But more importantly, developers can contribute code that improves or fixes the existing code base. The repo is accessible and writable anywhere so anyone can propose changes. The author of these changes are referred to as contributors. They create their own local copy of the official repo and make changes. They ask for the change to be merged into the official code with what is called a pull request. Anyone can be contributor, but established members are what called committers. They have a review authority on any proposed changes. A committer is responsible for evaluating the pull request. The pull command copies down the change and then they have a chance to review it. If they agree with the changes, it is merged back into the main code. Committers enforce code standards and usually require test code to demonstrate the code works as promised. Becoming a committer requires you have a proven track record and other committers who are willing to vouch for the quality of your work. It is worth mentioning here that there is no requirement that an open source project be a certain size. It can be a one person passion project or a huge developer's effort. It can be a tool a developer created to solve his own problem and thought that other devs might find it useful, to medium sized projects such as Homebrew or Node-RED, where a few companies or individuals are invested. In fact, once a project reaches a significant number of interested parties and especially commercial interest, the handling of future changes and plans gets a lot more formal. This formal designation typically follows a pretty standard naming convention. It is the project name plus the word foundation. You think of Apache Foundation, Linux Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, you get the idea, right? Okay, this brings us to a final element, the open source license. The open source license that spells out how the source code to be distributed, modified, and other stuff like attribution. The most common is the GPL, that is the General Public License. It guarantees four freedom: the freedom to run, study, share, and modify. This includes commercial for profit users too. Finally, the success of an open source project takes a community. It is made up of users, contributors, committers, and foundation members. So basically, an open source project starts with a great idea, developers, and some code. But projects don't have to start from scratch. They might start another open source project. One of the best known examples is Linux, which is based on Unix. If an open source project can get community interest, it gains contributors. Contributors eventually become committers. That user contributor committer cycle continues. With a good idea and bit of luck, a project gets enough regular contributors and committers that its growth becomes self sustaining. The cycle can also be turbocharged by industry contribution. For example, Kubernetes was open source by Google. Since it was based on their internal development, it benefited from Google's experience with container orchestration. Popularity of Kubernetes benefits adopters by allowing them rely on the foundation layer of software. So what can you do if you want to join the open source movement? Start by becoming a contributor or just by reporting bugs. Once you have experience with the code, start by contributing bug fixes. Once a few of your submissions are accepted, you are well on your way to becoming a committer. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon.